Hello and welcome to another Anatomy and Physiology II Bio 265 video in a nutshell. Today we're going to be talking about the cardiac cycle, and while it might look confusing, like a bunch of confusing lines that don't make sense, you're going to be surprised at how easy it is to understand. The entire graph is built around 4 points. Serious, just 4. So let's take a look at what's actually happening inside the heart so these lines start making sense. The heart, first thing to understand, is made out of muscle that can contract and then relax. Up at the top of the heart, there are 2 chambers called atria, and they squeeze and they push the blood through to the bottom portions of the heart called the ventricles, and the ventricles can then squeeze and they push the blood out either to the lungs or to the body. Now, I realize that in real life, all of these valves and arteries and everything's at the top of the heart, but this video is focused on heart function and not anatomy. So it's important to realize that this process is happening on both sides of the heart simultaneously, but we're just going to talk today mostly about the left side of the heart that supplies the body with blood. So let's zoom in on the valves of the heart. These little doors are moved by pressure. So if there's high pressure in the atria, it's going to push the door open, and the mitral or bicuspid valve will allow blood to flow through. And on the flip side, if the pressure's higher in the ventricle, then the door is going to be held shut. Remember, it's a one-way door. So those exact same principles of pressure are going to be true for all the valves, including, obviously, the aortic valve. So pause the video if you need to and answer these questions. Where do I need higher pressure if I want to open the aortic valve? Do I need that higher pressure inside of the ventricles or in the aorta? And on the flip side, if I want to close it, where do I need the higher pressure? Inside of the ventricles or inside the aorta? So the answer is higher pressure in the ventricles would push the door open, and if I wanted to close it, then I'm going to need higher pressure inside the aorta, and it's going to shut the door. Now that pressure is created when the muscles of the heart contract. And so when they contract, they squeeze the chamber to make it smaller, and pressure and volume are inversely related per Boyle's law. So in simple terms, what you can see here is when I squish things into a tiny space, they build up pressure and they want to get out. So that's what I'm doing with the blood inside of the heart. So let's throw out some general numbers for the pressures. Let's say the atrial pressure is about 5, and let's say that the pressure in the aorta is about 80. Suppose that the pressure in the ventricle is 10. If that was the case, which valves are going to be open? Or specifically, the mitral valve. Open or closed if it's 10. 10 is greater than 5, so the valve is going to be forced shut. However, 10 is less than 80, so the aortic valve is going to be shut. We can't pass 80, or we can't push open the aortic valve yet. So stepping back to how the heart contracts, remember the atria squeeze, and then the ventricles on the bottom are going to contract. So let's take all this info and put it into the actual chart. So remember, this entire chart focuses on the ventricles. So these terms on the bottom, systole, diastole, they refer to the ventricles. Systole means to contract, and diastole means to relax. So that means that between these 2 solid black lines right here, the heart is squeezing, the ventricle's contracting, and between these 2, the ventricle is relaxing. So what would you expect the pressure to do in the ventricle during systole or contraction? Well, as I squeeze the blood in the ventricle into a smaller space, the pressure is going to increase. And sure enough, we see that. And as soon as that ventricular pressure passes 5, you can see the blue line rising there, which valve is going to be affected as it comes up? Well, as soon as I pass 5, the mitral valve is going to be shut. Door is going to close. So let's take a look at the cardiac cycle. Sure enough, as soon as systole begins, right, our solid black line, the ventricular pressure goes flying up. You can see that in the blue pressure line. And notice the point where the ventricular pressure passes the atrial. It happens right where the ventricle begins to squeeze, right at the beginning of systole. 5 is easy to beat. Now, the moment where the ventricular pressure passes atrial, that is point number 1. It's where we get higher than 5. And we close the mitral door. Again, point number 1. Now let's think about the valves at this point. The mitral valve is just going to shut. We're higher than 5. But we have to pass 80 before the aortic valve can open. So at this point, which valves are open? Well, none of them. It's a trick question. we haven't built enough pressure yet to pass 80. But the ventricles are going to continue to squeeze, and the pressure is going to increase. It's going to keep going up. But until the pressure actually passes 80, the blood has nowhere to go. Appropriately, this phase is called isovolumic, or same volume. Both doors are shut. And let's take a look at the line for ventricular volume. Notice between the solid black and the dotted line for isovolumic, we see that the pressure is increasing. We aren't yet greater than 80, and our volume line is a flat line. The blood has nowhere to go until we pass 80. Mitral shut, aortic is not yet open. So once ventricular pressure passes 80, what's going to happen? Which valve? Well, we're going to be able to open the aortic valve. We're going to be able to push blood out into the aorta. See how nicely this lines up on the graph. That exact moment when ventricular pressure passes aortic, so here's the ventricular rising, we have our aortic chilling at 80. Notice that the exact point where they cross is right at the dotted line that marks the end of isovolumic. Now the blood has somewhere to go. We're beginning to eject blood into the aorta. And that is point number 2. So if we're ejecting blood into the aorta, what do you expect the ventricular volume to do? Well, you would expect it, obviously, to decrease. We're ejecting out, pushing everything through that aortic valve. And so when we take a look at the chart, that's exactly what we see. We see that decrease in ventricular volume. Now, the ventricles are squeezing, we're in systole, we're pushing blood out, and as long as the ventricle's squeezing in systole, the pressures at the top between the aorta and the ventricle are kind of fighting back and forth, but the valve's still open. However, as soon as the ventricles stop squeezing, right there at the black line of diastole, the aortic valve's going to shut. Notice that right there is when we see the aortic black line peak above the ventricular blue line, 0.3. In the same way that it took some time now for the ventricle to build from 5 to 80, it's going to take some time for it to relax from 80 back down to below 5. So during this phase where it's relaxing, which valves are open? Well, trick question, none of them. You can figure that out because I'm less than 80, but not yet less than 5. Aortic valve shut, and we have another isovolumic relaxation phase. We're waiting to drop below the atrial line, and again, we have a flat line for our volume. You can see it there on the bottom. All right, so again, less than 80, but not yet less than 5 for our ventricle. Once we get below what number, our mitral valve is going to reopen? Well, you know the answer. You got it less than 5. So as soon as the ventricle relaxes enough to get to 4, it's going to open up the mitral valve and blood can flow through. And that is going to mark, you see where the blue line drops below the atrial black line is point number 4, and that marks the opening of the mitral valve, or the reopening, I should say. So then we have this phase of rapid inflow, and we have this sudden increase in ventricular volume as the blood rushes into the ventricles. Now let's do a quick review and see if you can list which valve is affected and why it's opening or closing, and why. So first, take a look. We have our first point, or number 1. We have our mitral valve that is going to reopen. So right there we have point number 1. Why is it opening or closing? Then we are going to have our point number 2. Why is it opening or closing? Point 3, our aortic valve is going to close. Why is it closing? And mitral valve, why is it reopening? Think about the pressures in the actual heart squeezing. So let's jump back over to diastole. We have this initial rush of blood that's going to level out over time, and then we have this phase called diastasis. It's literally diastasis, diastole, same root. It means arrest. Not much is happening. It kind of levels out. Arrest within arrest. And then the last phase we're going to have is going to be our atrial systole phase, which is going to happen right as the atria squeezes, and it's going to push the last little bit of blood into the ventricles. You can see that slight peak in the volume as it goes up. We're kind of topping off the ventricle. So then the entire process is going to happen all over again. We're going to have another black line of systole that's going to occur, and the entire cycle is going to happen all over again. So we have our black line of systole, and then we have our rise in ventricular volume, and then we close our mitral door, and then we build up to open our aorta. The whole thing's going to happen all over again. Anyway, the last two lines we need to talk about are the heart sounds and the EKG. And heart sounds are really super straightforward when you realize that they are made when valves close. So which valves represent valves closing of these four? Well, 1 and 3. So after 1 and 3, sure enough, look what we see. We see heart sounds. The ones that are valves closing make a sound. Now, the EKG, it's super easy. I know that there's this whole thing in your textbook about dipoles and movement inside the heart. This is in a nutshell. Let's make it simple. The EKG is just electrical instructions. It tells the heart what to do. The P wave is the instruction that tells the atria to squeeze. The QRS complex tells the ventricles to squeeze, and the T wave tells the ventricles to relax. Now, if you were paying attention, you notice there isn't electrical instruction telling the atria to relax, just to contract. The reason this happens is because the atrial relaxation instructions happen during the QRS complex. The ventricular QRS is so big it buries the atrial signal. We don't see it. It still happens. Now, think about these instructions kind of like the starting gun at a race. The gun goes off, and then the runners leave their marks just a half second later when they hear it. Just like that, the electrical signal comes first, and then the heart muscles are actually able to respond just a second later. So the instruction comes first, and then the heart muscles are able to respond. So if we take a look at the cardiac cycle graph, you will notice that our QRS complex happens right before the beginning of systole, right before the solid black line. The T wave, telling the ventricle to relax, happens right before diastole, which is what it causes or tells the heart to do, and the P wave is going to happen right before atrial systole, which is telling the atria to squeeze. So there you have it, the whole cardiac cycle based off of 4 points. If you can remember which valves are opening or closing, and then think about why are they opening or closing? Why is the pressure high or low? And which part of the heart is squeezing to make that pressure high and low? If you can just envision the heart beating, you could draw this graph from memory any day. You got this. Good luck with your studies. Thank you.